Well, hello everyone. How are y'all doing? Fantastic. My name is Carrie Barsk Crawford. I'm the director of the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area. So we are co-sponsoring Dr. Reality's talk tonight with the Florence Lauderdale Public Library. So thank you to Abby and all of the library staff for bringing this all together. The Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area is one of 62 national heritage areas across the United States. Heritage areas are a program of the National Park Service that began in the 1980s as a way to essentially take the mission of the Park Service outside of park boundaries. So when we think of national parks, there are very large landscapes, obviously, like the Canyon and Zion and Bryce, right? Big, beautiful parks. There's small historical parks that interpret specific pieces of history, but heritage areas are a bit different because they're lived in landscapes, right? You all live within the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area. So it's a culturally significant landscape designated for national significance. So stories that really help us to understand what it means to be an American. They can vary in size and focus dramatically. So the Erie Canalway Heritage Corridor is 351 miles long, right? Runs along the borders and boundaries of the Erie Canal, so a very long, narrow National Heritage Area. The Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area encompasses the entire state of Tennessee, so just to our north. And so heritage areas focus on what makes that geographic landscape and boundary significant. So here in the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, we cover 6 counties, and these are counties that are today, or were in the case of Franklin County, connected to the Muscle Shoals stretch of the Tennessee River. So that stretch of the Tennessee River essentially divided the Tennessee River into 2, the Upper Tennessee and the Lower Tennessee. About an 80-mile stretch, 40 miles were really, really bad, but about 80 miles of shallow, rocky, rapid-filled water that had a drop of over 130 feet and 37 miles. To put that in perspective, Niagara Falls is about 167 feet. So if you think about that, it's spread out, but the river is dropping pretty dramatically for that period of time. So the Muscle Shoals really shaped how life unfolded here in Northwest Alabama. And so we explore that story of the river and how it has impacted life here, stretching back thousands and thousands of years to Native Americans coming here and arriving here, all the way through to how people interact with the river today. We also explore Native American history and heritage, focusing again on that long history of Native Americans, but we also pay quite a bit of attention to the Trail of Tears, and then how Native Americans and indigenous people today live and work in the heritage area. And then the most fun theme is Muscle Shoals music. So that's not just a nationally significant story, but an internationally significant story. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Chris Reali to talk to us tonight about this last theme. Dr. Reali is an assistant professor of music at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He's a cultural musicologist who studies popular music by examining the relationship between local music scenes and the national music industry. He has presented at numerous conferences, including the American Musicological Society. I got it that time. That was a mouthful. The Society for American Music and the Society for Ethnomusicology. He has published works in Southern cultures as well as the New Grove Dictionary of American Music and the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. He's also toured internationally as a guitar tech and manager for Chris Whitley, and as a guitar and bass drum tech for David Gray. So, welcome, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. All right. So thank you so much. Some space here. So it's great to be back at Florence at the library. I spent a significant amount of time over the course of 3 different trips, 2011, maybe 2013, and then 2019, conducting research in the Shoals at the Hall of Fame, and then also upstairs with Lee Freeman in the local history. I also spent time at the Sheffield Public Library, the Muscle Shoals Library, and anywhere else that had stuff that I thought would be fun to look at. And I was also fortunate to conduct about 50 interviews with people who were involved in the music scene here. They're not all still with us, unfortunately. But I was very honored to talk to them. And so I want to thank Carrie and the Heritage Area and Abby and the staff at the library for having me here. So it's an honor. It really is an absolute honor for me to speak about my work in the place where it all happened. And I'm a little bit nervous too, because I know some of you, I don't know all of you, so there could be some people in the audience who know a lot more about this than I do, so just bear with me. I'm going to give a kind of a formal talk, and hopefully we'll have time for questions later on. So, Music and Mystique in Muscle Shoals is the first comprehensive examination of the seminal music area, music scene. And the book reveals, basically, the goal was to reveal the deep connections between the music produced in the Shoals and the musical and cultural fabric of America. And so the foundation of the book is what I call the Muscle Shoals Mystique. So I came up with this phrase about in 2010. And it is this idea that it's a nexus of musical and cultural events that facilitated the dissemination, let me slow this down, of music cultivated by northern-based record executives and sought by many to satiate their need for an authentic Black South. So that becomes that's basically the underpinnings of the entire book. And ingrained within the so-called Muscle Shoals sound are notions of Southern identity, musical authenticity, and conceptions about Black American culture. And so the book weaves together the history of numerous Muscle Shoals session musicians, the musical and social and cultural events that led to Aretha Franklin's 1967 recording session at Fame, and the relationship between the real and imagined South to the Muscle Shoals music industry. And the book also documents the close connections between country music and the Muscle Shoals music industry that began in the mid-1970s, and details how the region transformed into a revered cultural tourism destination by exploiting its storied musical past. So today I'm going to talk about a few of the topics that I covered in the book, because you can just read the book. I'm going to first talk about the Singing River legend, the origins of the Singing River legend. I'll also discuss the origins of the Shoals recording industry. And one of my goals in this section is to reinsert some names into the historical record that have been left out of other sources. And there's quite a few names that have been left out. And I'm going to guess some of the information, if you haven't already read the book, some of this information might surprise a few of you. And then starting in the 1970s, the Shoals music scene became a very active contributor to country music. And that music history has been overlooked by pretty much everybody. So I'm going to highlight some of those accomplishments today. And as for the music recorded here, I'll talk about the series of events that caused Paul Simon to record in Muscle Shoals in the early 1970s, which exemplify my concept of the Muscle Shoals mystique. And then finally, I'm going to come back to the Singing River and how the term evolved into a marketing slogan and used to promote the cultural tourism. And so I encourage anybody of you in the audience who are part of the scene in any way to share your stories and memories with us during the Q&A. So, 20th century American popular music has had its fair share of creation stories. So consider the 1927 Big Bang of country music when Ralph Peer discovered Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family, or Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records in Memphis, where Elvis first recorded. Phillips is often credited with inventing rock and roll during the mid-1950s, but these stories provide simplified versions of often complicated events that serve as rallying points for local communities to celebrate and promote shared histories. In the case of Muscle Shoals, the creation story, the Singing River legend, was in place long before the mid-20th century flowering of the local recording industry. The Muscle Shoals music scene achieved significant commercial success by the early 1970s, yet this creation story has only recently become integral to the promotion of the region's musical history. So while I was doing research for this topic, which is one of the last things I wrote in the book, I came across, I discovered that the Shoals is not the only home of the Singing River, and maybe some of you know this. Pascagoula, Mississippi, located at the mouth of the Mississippi River and about 350 miles south of the Shoals, also promotes a legend of the Singing River. And the origins of the Pascagoula legend predate the Florence version recorded by James Jackson, who was the founder of Florence. So Lauren Thompson was awarded a New Deal era commission to create a mural in the Pascagoula post office that commemorated the legend. And this is the image that still hangs today in the library, in the post office. So although some have traced the origins of the Alabama so-called Singing River legend to about the 1820s, the earliest published version is The Legend of Muscle Shoals and the Story of Florence, which appeared in 1917 and was written by Mrs. Emmett O'Neill, Elizabeth Kirkman, the wife of a former Alabama governor and a Florence native. I'm assuming the O'Neill Bridge is named after Governor O'Neill. So on July 6, 1917, the Florence Times printed an excerpt from her pamphlet under the headline, Mrs. Emmett O'Neill's Interesting Letter. And the impact of this pamphlet upon the Muscle Shoals region and the local music scene there has been profound. So she writes, "All ye who doubt, listen to the legend of Muscle Shoals," exclaimed Mrs. O'Neill. According to the pamphlet, the Cherokees believed that in the infancy of the world, the Great Spirit imprisoned the goddess of the Tennessee beneath the rushing waters of Muscle Shoals, while her lover, the Prince of the Power of the Air, hovered above. Only with the appearance of a human mighty magician, who, with a wave of his wand, would bring together these spirits of water and air. Then would flow such a rain of peace and plenty as had never been before known on earth. Mrs. O'Neill's flowery prose is a significantly anglicized version of the so-called Native American legend, marking her story's origins as highly speculative, and the word singing does not actually appear in this version of the legend at all. The mighty magician, for Mrs. O'Neill, turned out to be modern science and the engineering needed to complete what would become known as the Wilson Dam. So the likely purpose of the O'Neill's pamphlet was to spur interest in the completion of the dam, and as many of you might know, like that was people were not necessarily interested in the dam at that time. It took a little effort to get it happening. And the dam was begun in 1918. As a former First Lady of Alabama, Mrs. O'Neill's pamphlet exerted considerable socio-cultural influence as it circulated through the press, social circles, and beyond. So 3 years after the pamphlet's publication, the legend of Muscle Shoals appeared in History Stories of Alabama. And I'd be curious if anybody actually remembers using this book in school. So this source was adopted by the State Board of Education as a 4th grade textbook and used at least into the 1950s. Anybody? Maybe. I know it's a while ago, so you're like, yeah, maybe. So, and then I searched through newspaper records, and there was like they used to publish lists of books that parents needed to buy their students, and it was published in many sources across Alabama listed this into the 50s. I just stopped at that point. I was like, I don't need to know when it ended, but it was quite some time. And by 1952, I think it was the Anderson Star exclaimed that the textbook should be read by every child, every citizen of the state. So this clearly circulated widely across Alabama education. In 1982, the Times Daily published a 9-part series called Shoals Musical Roots that detailed the history of the local recording industry. And this was, as far as I know, this was the first sort of version of the long history of the scene in print by anybody. And the first article, Indians First Area Musicians, makes no mention of the Singing River legend. Instead, the author remarks that the area's native inhabitants, quote, had no idea that their music was a harbinger of the rich musical tradition that eventually would evolve in their homeland. At some point, the legend of the Muscle Shoals and the legend of the Singing River became synonymous. So starting in the late 1980s, William McDonald, the former city historian of Florence, wrote articles on the city's history, the Singing River, and Native American culture that frequently appeared in the Times Daily and other sources. In 1989, McDonald published The Lore of the River, The Shoals of Long Ago, which included this quote on the back cover. Amidst the mighty roar of the Tennessee as it plunged over the rocks, reefs, and around islands and sandbars at Muscle Shoals, could be heard a sweetly singing voice from beneath its waters. So the murmured secrets in Mrs. O'Neill's 1917 pamphlet had transformed it into a sweetly singing voice. So McDonald's widely circulated writings helped to refine and perpetuate the myth. In 1991, McDonald even predicted the use of the Singing River myth by the local recording industry. One of these popular Indian myths, the Singing River, McDonald wrote, could easily become a part of the music industry's promotion of the sound of the shoals. When I stumbled across this at UNA, I was really amazed by this, because it was decades before anybody even thought about this. But apparently it didn't go much further than this. So this particular Alabama history story unleashed a powerful cultural force that has since shaped the promotion and reception of the Muscle Shoals music scene. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the music scene here itself. So, I'm going to turn this down just a little bit. Let me edge your feet back. There we go. So as Florence grew from a frontier town into a city over the 19th century, music culture also developed. As in many other towns and cities in the 1800s, churches provided the primary source of music making for people living in and around Florence. By the mid-1800s, the region was home to numerous brass bands. Choral clubs and community choruses formed in the early 1900s. And Florence was home to several music venues by 1890, including East Florence Opera House and the Academy of Music, which is also an opera house. And thank the Florence Library for posting this on their Facebook page, so I was able to snatch that. Sheffield and Tuscumbia boasted their own opera houses starting around 1891. And these venues were used for various forms of entertainment, including traveling performances, minstrel shows, civic events, and weddings, as was common in these types of spaces. Florence's location on a major river and the city's proximity to Nashville and Memphis meant that touring groups of performers would occasionally pass through the town, making for a fairly rich musical culture during the early part of the 20th century. And I'm indebted to Nancy Gauntz, and she said she was coming for her work on detailing the rich cultural life of the Shoals in the 19th and 20th centuries, and she was kind enough to share her work with me, which I incorporated in the book. And actually, when I was here in 2019, I actually ran into her. There was that sort of odd drugstore thing on the corner of Court Street, and I walked in and I was like, oh, Nancy Gauntz, because her address was listed somewhere else, and I didn't even know I was staying right across the street from her office. I was like, oh, hey, Nancy, I'm Chris, we met, and she's like, oh, I remember you, and it was like, and then that was it. So it was total happenstance, we just ran into each other, so small towns, right? So, so for many raised in and near the Shoals, music provided an escape for their small town existence. And many of you are familiar with the names of W.C. Handy, Sam Phillips, and Buddy Killen, all Shoals area natives who went on to great musical successes. Unfortunately, time doesn't permit me discussing their significant accomplishments. So before the rise of the Muscle Shoals recording industry in the late 1950s, the area would have been coded musically as country based on the semi-rural location and primarily white population. Quentin Claunch moved with his family from Tishomingo, Mississippi to the Shoals in 1941 when his father took a job at the Reynolds aluminum factory, as many people did in that day. So Claunch also worked at the factory where he met fellow guitarist Edgar Clayton, and the two began to perform as the Dixie Pals. Within a few years, the group added Bill Cantrell on fiddle and Dexter Johnson on bass, and they had their own radio show on WLAY where Sam Phillips worked. In 1946, the Dixie Pals changed their name to the Blue Seal Pals and began to perform 5 days a week on WJOI, also in Florence. After auditioning for George Hay, founder of the Grand Ole Opry, the group moved to Nashville in 1947 to perform on WSM's Sunrise Serenade every Saturday morning. The group disbanded in 1948 when Clayton signed as a solo artist with the Nashville-based Tennessee record label, and Tennessee was the name of the label. Claunch moved to Memphis, where he worked as a traveling salesman for a while. In the mid-1950s, Claunch began doing session work as a guitarist for Sam Phillips on early recordings at Sun Records. As a songwriter, Claunch found initial success with the song Daydreaming, a track he co-wrote with Cantrell and Bud Deckelman that was recorded by Jimmy Newman and released by Dot Records. So Dot Records is a significant connection between the bridge between the Shoals and Nashville and the Shoals and the world at large. Claunch and Cantrell also worked on sessions in Memphis during the mid-1950s for Meteor Records with guitarist Terry Thompson, and in 1956 with Florence-based singer Junior Thompson, and as far as I can tell, there's no relation between the two. In 1957, Claunch and Cantrell formed Hyatt Records, and in the mid-60s, after several years away from the music business, Claunch established Goldwax Records, also in Memphis. Clayton eventually returned to the Shoals in the early 1950s, where he worked as a DJ and broadcast the Shoals Music Jamboree on WLAY from the Sheffield Community Center. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but that might precede maybe in the audience. The show featured local bands, which often included a young Buddy Killen. In 1960, Clayton began a long association with singer Sonny James, who was a childhood friend, and Johnson eventually returns to the Shoals to Sheffield and builds an amateur recording studio in 1951. And so my sincere thanks to Tony Lee of the Wildwood Trio, who suggested I explore the connections between Claunch, Clayton, and Cantrell and the musical history of the Shoals. Actually, it was Tony who actually introduced me to Stephanie back in 2019. So although the Blue Seal Pals got their start in the Shoals, the only member of the group who tends to be associated with the formation of the Shoals recording industry is Dexter Johnson. He was the first person to build a recording studio in the era, and his nephew Jimmy, as many of you know, became a significant part of the Shoals recording scene. So moreover, like Claunch, Clayton was not originally from the Shoals, and that seems to be what these guys seem to be written out of history because none of them were actually from the Shoals. Clayton was born in Bexar, which is about 65 miles southwest of Florence. And Cantrell was born in the Shoals, but for some reason his contributions have not been that well documented. So while Johnson is important to some aspects of the Shoals scene, the connections between Claunch, Clayton, and Cantrell and the formation of the Muscle Shoals recording industry are more significant, or at least they are in my opinion. All three were a part of a broader musical network that connected the Shoals with Nashville and Memphis. And so starting in the mid-1950s, Claunch and Cantrell began to get cuts as songwriters, writing by themselves and with each other for artists on Sun Records, as well as labels like RCA. So after Dot Records releases the Newman song in 1955, the label released many tracks either written or recorded by Shoals area musicians. And although Claunch, Clayton, and Cantrell did not directly participate in the burgeoning Shoals recording scene industry in the 50s, or later 50s, they were among the first musicians to capitalize on their successes first achieved performing in the area. And so the next wave of Shoals-based music entrepreneurs certainly leveraged their connections to the former Blue Seal Pals, particularly Claunch, Clayton, and Cantrell, as a springboard to the national recognition. And if they didn't launch the connection with those guys individually, they certainly leveraged the fact that those guys pioneered the connections to Dot Records and many other places. So despite the success of people like Cantrell and Claunch, the formation of the Muscle Shoals music industry was ad hoc. In December '56, James Joyner, the owner of the Florence bus terminal and an aspiring songwriter, asked Bobby Denton, who was then in his senior year of high school, to record a newly composed song, A Fallen Star. and the cost of the recording was $10. And so I found this when I was doing research at the Alabama Music Hall of Fame. In either the Bobby Denton file or the James Joyner file was the check stubs from Tune Records. And so it says Benny Lott, engineering recording, $6. I was able to find there are other sources that confirmed that Benny Lott was indeed the engineer at WLAY at that time, and that Joyner paid the WLAY $4 to rent the studio for the time. So this whole industry is built on a $10 investment. That's a pretty good ROI, if you ask me. So yeah, I was like ecstatic when I found that. So Joyner, along with a group of partners who include Kelsa Hurston, and Kelsa Hurston, right, is another significant name that goes on to lots of success in Nashville. That I didn't focus on him. He's a whole book study right there. So they form Tune Publishing, Tune Records in '56, which is the first record company in Alabama, and then Tune Publishing in July '57. So Denton's recording of A Fallen Star achieved significant regional success on the radio and made him a hometown star. So let's take a listen to a little bit of Bobby singing. I apologize in advance. I'm going to have to stop recording because we just don't have that kind of time. So more importantly, the song further strengthened the musical networks between Nashville and Muscle Shoals. So Dot Records released the Jimmy Newman version of A Fallen Star in March of '57, and it's possible that the Denton recording actually may have been a demo. It's hard to, I can't really prove that, but it seems like that the first widely commercial available release was this Jimmy Newman recording. And the song was also recorded by several country musicians, including Bill Monroe, Ferlin Husky, the Hilltoppers, Ray Price, and the comedy duo of Lorenzo and Oscar. And all these recordings are June of 1957. So those of you who aren't aware, back in the day in the music industry, it was very common to release cover versions of songs. People didn't think of songs as only belonging to a band or an artist. It was very common to have. And if it was a hit song, everybody recorded it. So the members of the Shoals' fledgling music industry relied upon the multiple services provided by the Nashville musical establishment in order to realize their potential. And so Joyner didn't envision starting a recording industry in Alabama. Instead, he viewed his Florence-based operation as a springboard to Nashville for aspiring musicians. So the regional success of A Fallen Star attracted eager musicians to the area. So Rick Hall and Billy Sherrill performed together in a local band called the Fairlanes and pitched their original songs to Joyner. So Denton recorded Sweet and Innocent, written by Hall and Sherrill, but the B-side is Back to School, which is co-written by Claunch for Judd Records, owned by Judd Phillips, Sam's brother. And the song was recorded at Owen Bradley's Nashville studio in 1958. And Killing produced the Denton session, which featured veteran Nashville studio musicians. The Hall and Sherrill song received wider recognition when RCA's Chet Atkins produced Roy Orbison's cover of the song the same year. Denton would go on to perform Back to School on the Dick Clark Show in September 6, 1958, and the singer briefly toured with Musical Review promoted by the show's host. And I know that seeing that performance, several musicians, Norbert Putnam told me, they were like, oh my God, we could do that too. And so that was another significant moment for all the future musicians in the area when they saw that. So a cottage music industry developed in the Shoals in 1958 and 59. Denton befriended Tom Stafford, the manager of the Shoals Theater, and they began to write songs together. I know some of you know the story, but if I cut the stuff out, the other things don't make sense, so I gotta retell it. So, and Denton told me that he and Stafford built the recording studio upstairs over the City Drugstore on Tennessee Street in Florence. And that the primitive studio was used for recording song demos to pitch to record labels and publishers. And so with finances partially supplied by Joyner, Stafford formed SPAR, which is Stafford Publishing and Recording, and Florence, Alabama Music Enterprises, fame with Hall and Sherrill. So Norbert Putnam was one of the young musicians who hung around at SPAR, and he writes in his autobiography, most nights at SPAR were a repeat of the night before, one bad songwriter and another bad song. So the connections to the Nashville music scene, however, provided the Shoals musicians with an outlet for their songs, and many of which were recorded by both major and major and independent labels. And so I know this is going to be hard to read because it's small. This table is reprinted in the book, but through the research, I was able to sort of discover there's a lot of stuff happening in the Shoals and through the Shoals. And so you'll see in '57 all the various versions of A Fallen Star, and then I know I don't have time to have this up there and have you look it up all, but there's a lot of things happening. So some fairly significant successes are going on. This is all before You Better Move On is recorded here in the Shoals. And so in the book, I preface this, when the Shoals scene takes off in the mid-60s, one writer was like, oh, there was nothing happening here before 1964. And I say, no, there was a ton of stuff happening here. It's just that no one had done the work at that time, because it would have been hard to get that information. And so there's one more. So again, some of these songs are significant, some of these are now forgotten, but there was a lot of things going on. So in 1960, Stafford and Cheryl parted ways with Hall and sold Hall the Fame name. And so Cheryl left the Shoals sometime in '61 for Nashville, where he worked as a recording engineer for Sam Phillips and eventually becoming an influential songwriter and producer, and he goes on to enormous success. So Hall, working with local white teenage musicians, recorded You Better Move On in '61, written and performed by Sheffield native Arthur Alexander, an R&B track that charted in Billboard and Cashbox. So let's take a listen to, and again, Dot Records. And with the royalties earned from that recording, Hall builds This Is the First version of Fame, and it's still out there across the river in a much bigger sense. Although I love the fact that that building on the right hand side, that's the echo chamber. That's the famous Fame echo chamber. So, where was I? And so Hall and the studio musicians that included Terry Thompson, Norbert Putnam, Jerry Carrigan, David Briggs, Earl Prenette Montgomery, and others recorded many tracks for a variety of artists, and some of which became regional and national hits. And just as a small aside, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Tam song, which just left my brain. What a Fool Do You Think I Am? And so when I did my dissertation in Chapel Hill, and in the super small world, the woman the young girl who played flute on that recording happened to work at the library in Chapel Hill, and so she was the best flute player in the state, and her dad happened to work for the TVA, and so she got called up to go to play I called the local, I don't know if it was Coffee High School, was like, we need a flute player, and they sent her down, and so her name was Jill Shires, and so she just went in and played the cold, and they forgot who she was, and so it was like, oh, that's really cool. So just again, luck. So thank you for that. So she was the music library. She was the catalog librarian for the music collection. So it was like, and I was a music student, so it was like such a small world. So and she went on to a very significant career playing in the LA scene as a contemporary performer of classical stuff, and then she became a librarian. So it's great. This is very crazy. But with the release of Percy Sledge's When a Man Loves a Woman in '66 by New York-based Atlantic Records, a song recorded by Quinn Ivey at Neurala Studios in Sheffield, the Shoals became one of the top destinations to record R&B. So let's take a listen to that as well. So the success of the Sledge recording ultimately convinced Atlantic Records to producer Jerry Wexler to record singer Wilson Pickett at Fame. So I'm just going to a couple slides here. So this is a well-known picture of Pickett surrounded by the session musicians, and Wexler is the older guy in the middle with the glasses. And this is a picture of Pickett with Jimmy Johnson and Bobby Womack. This is probably 1966 or 67. And one of my favorite pictures is this picture of Pickett leaning over Springer Oldham with as Junior Lowe in the back. And there was an interview with Roger Hawkins, and he said he was really nervous when Pickett first showed up. And so Pickett says, they were talking about the groove on Land of a Thousand Dances. Pickett says, "Hey man, play this," and then claps out. And so when I saw this picture, I just imagined Pickett encouraging the band to do something like that. So let's take a listen to that drum break. And Hawkins is like 19 when he does this. '67 proved to be a watershed year for Fame. And by this time, Fame's rhythm section included guitarist Jimmy Johnson, drummer Roger Hawkins, bassist David Hood, keyboardist Barry Beckett, and guitarist Junior Lowe. Aretha Franklin recorded I Never Loved the Man the Way I Love You at Fame, a track that resurrected her stalled career and further boosted the studio's reputation. And just a few of the Southern Soul recordings produced in '67 at Fame included Sweet Soul Music by Arthur Conley, Tell Mama by Etta James, and Funky Broadway by Wilson Pickett. In 1962, there was one recording studio in the Shoals. By 1972, the area included 8 studios. From the late 1960s to the mid-1970s, top acts such as Cher, the staple singers, the Osmonds, Paul Simon, Boz Scaggs, Paul Anka, Linda Ronstadt, Rod Stewart, Willie Nelson, everyone came here. Bob Dylan all traveled to the Shoals to record.
Hi, this is Lee Freeman, and you're watching North Alabama Local History.
And what's also interesting too is that, I'll talk about this a little bit, so this is the Muscle Shoals Music Association apparently runs this ad. This is 72, so Billboard doesn't lie. So I'm going to pivot and talk to you a little bit about country music in the Shoals. So shifts in country and pop and R&B markets during the 70s and early 80s created a space for the Shoals music industry to make inroads into and become a creative force within the national country music scene. Yet the mystique of white musicians performing black music has thoroughly overshadowed the country music successes achieved by numerous Shoals-based musicians, producers, and songwriters. The 2013 documentary makes no reference to the country music legacy of the Shoals. To put it mildly, the Shoals' impact on country music is significant. In the early 1960s, George Jones began to record songs written or co-written by Earl Peanut Montgomery, and many of the songs were written and were recorded by Jones with Melba Montgomery, which is Peanut's sister. And Peanut would go on to co-write 73 songs for George Jones, several #1 songs, in addition to playing in his band and producing for him as well. And as I mentioned, Billy Sherrill goes on to produce Tammy Wynette and a hugely influential songwriter and producer and an architect of basically the late 60s country sound, what people often refer to as a classic country era. So by the early 1970s, fame and Muscle Shoals sound dominated the Shoals recording scene, producing a mix of R&B and pop records as each studio generated numerous hits, but neither they nor any other Shoals-based studios attracted much business from artists identified with country music. There were a couple songs here and there, but Willie Nelson recorded sound, but that was basically a one-off product. So recognizing an opportunity, Al Cartier and George Soule opened Music Bill in 1974, a studio that catered to country artists. And within a few months of the opening of the studio, Norval Feltz recorded Reconsider Me, a faithful cover of a 1969 soul track by Johnny Adams. The Feltz track reached #2 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart and was also recognized as the best country single by Billboard in 1975. That same year, Hank Williams Jr. recorded his breakthrough album, Hank Williams Jr. and Friends at Music Mill. So recordings produced at Music Mill resulted in more than 30 chart singles and 15 chart LPs, according to Billboard. And Music Mill was only around for about 5 years. It was a very, very brief, right? Something very, very, very short time window. And the key to Music Mill's early success was a blend of Nashville country artists with Shoals pop musicians. So more country artists began to record in the Shoals during the beginning of the early 80s, but it was songwriters based in the Shoals who exerted a significant influence on the country music. So in the early 1980s, the Shoals-based scene began a slow transition from a recording studio culture to a songwriting music publishing culture. And publishing had always been a huge part of the studio, but it became even more significant in the late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, into the present. So songwriters Mac McAnally and Donnie Lowry signed with Wishbone Productions and Muscle Shoals, and the pair wrote Old Flame, a #1 track for the vocal group Alabama in 1981. So speaking about those writers in 2019, Terry Woodford, who owned Wishbone at the time, told me, I couldn't get them to write country songs. They didn't want to write country songs. They were just so good at what they did. But when country started turning a little more pop, it worked for them. Old Flame sure changed Mac McAnally and Donnie Lowry's mind about writing country music songs. So it's funny how #1 song will do that. Oh, I can go that way. So talk to Stephanie. So also in 1981, famed staff artists Walt Aldridge and Tommy Brassfield wrote "There's No Getting Over Me," which Ronnie Milsap took to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 Hot Country Singles chart, #2 on the Adult Contemporary chart, and #5 on the Hot 100. I mean, that's a significant. That's the ultimate crossover of success. So let's take a little listen to this. Argue in the book is that one of the reasons I think that country music historians don't talk about this so much is because this music was kind of poo-pooed by hardcore country fans. Don't like this era because it's too crossovers, too poppy. But Muscle Shoals specialized in that, and so they kind of look down, they look askance at some of this stuff. I mean, people talk about Millsap, but sorry, TV. But I think that's one of the reasons people have overlooked this. So. Aldridge, Brassfield, and McNally also wrote or co-wrote numerous hit country songs for T.G. Shepherd. He was a humongous star that's, again, more or less been forgotten by pretty much everybody in history, music history, or otherwise. He scored 7 top 10 hits between February '85 and December '87. Again, a significant achievement in a very short window of time. Robert Byrne was a songwriter who worked with Terry Woodford and Clayton Ivey at Wishbone Productions, and at some point in the early 80s, Byrne signed with Fame as a songwriter. Between May of '86 and July of '87, Byrne began a remarkable streak of songwriting success that resulted in 4 #1 songs and 1 #2 track. And each of these songs he wrote was either published or co-published by Rick Hall Music, Hall's ASCAP affiliated publishing company. And Hall's publishing company placed second on Billboard's top country singles publishers list in '87 with 10 charted singles. Again, that is remarkable success in such a short period of time. Gary Baker and Frank Myers wrote the international smash I Swear, a song recorded by John Malcolm Montgomery in 1983 that stayed at #1 spot on the Billboard's Hot Country Singles and Tracks chart for 4 weeks. And the R&B group All For One's version then held the top spot on the Billboard Hot 100 for 11 weeks in '94. And I didn't realize that Atlantic had gotten these pink labels. It's kind of funny. It's like, again, it's the '90s, right? So that's what happened. So, within 2 years of the song's release, the sales reached over 20 million worldwide, and the tune, co-published by Rick Hall Music, was probably the biggest copyright ever from Muscle Shoals, and it still may be the case. Again, it's hard to verify that, but I mean, it is, if not the top, it is close. As Hall noted in his autobiography, every publisher in the music business dreams of having a copyright like that. And so this is the BMI award that's hanging at fame. And I no doubt this is whenever this was made, there's way more sales there's way more sales now than there were when this award was made. So Walt Aldridge, Mac McAnally, Billy Lawson, Brad Chrysler, Mark Narmore, Tony Colton, James LeBlanc, and others connected to the Shoals music publishing firms placed songs at or near the top of the country charts well into the 2000s, and people still do to this day. There are numerous chart-topping country artists who traveled to the Shoals in the 1980s to record it or mix it. Fame, Sound, Music Mill, or Wishbone, or so many other studios, including the Amazing Rhythm Aces, Mac Davis, Jerry Reed, the Oak Ridge Boys, and John Conley. And of course, Shenandoah, one of the biggest acts to emerge in the late 1980s, was from Muscle Shoals and produced by Rick Hall and Robert Pernin. They are, as far as I know, they actually started recording again not that long ago. They've doing some stuff at Fame within the past 6 months, if I'm not mistaken. Barry Beckett left Muscle Shoals Sound in '84, moved to Nashville, and began to work for Warner Brothers. And his first project was co-producing Montana Cafe, Hank Williams Jr.'s #1 album from 1986 that sold over 500,000 copies in 5 months. Williams continued working with Beckett, and their partnership resulted in Hank Live from 1987, another gold record, as well as Born to Boogie from '87. It's a platinum-selling record that's 1 million sales, which was the Country Music Association's Album of the Year in 1988. And Beckett also produced the Alabama's Southern Star in 1989, which yielded 4 #1 singles. The music industry trade magazine Cashbox honored Beckett as the top country music producer from 1990. And Beckett would go on to shape the sound of country music with his production work on albums by Katie Osmond, Vince Gill, Kenny Chesney, and Lori Morgan. The sounds of popular country music in the 1980s and 90s was very closely connected to the musicians from the Shoals. In 1994 alone, I Swear topped Billboard's year-end hot country singles and tracks list, followed by Neil McCoy's Wink, which is a track produced by Beckett. Sociologist George Lipset has referred to seemingly desperate yet interrelated events that as the long fetch of history. So Lipset uses the analogy that waves crashing on the beach actually begin as ripples far to sea. And this became another underpinning, theoretical underpinning of the book. Like, all these stories are connected to something happened in the past, and I want to unearth the past to sort of explain how or why things happened here. And so Lipset writes, events that seem to appear in the present from out of nowhere and actually have a long history behind them. And that's like, duh, but it's a very simple but profound concept. And so in the 1960s, recording studios in the Shoals, and Fame in particular, primarily recorded R&B music, and R&B was code for black music. And black musicians like Wilson Pickett, James and Bobby Purify, Aretha Franklin, Etta James, and many others, who were accompanied by the white studio musicians from Muscle Shoals, helped to create much of the late 1960s soul soundtrack for audiences black and white. And as Franklin quickly became the iconic public face of soul music in the late 1960s, the reputation of Muscle Shoals as a leading destination for recording black music, along with the stature of the studio musicians who worked there, increased and grew. So the Muscle Shoals mystique had begun to seep into pop music, or further seep into pop music consciousness, and artists whom audiences would not consider as part of a soul music aesthetic began to travel to Northwest Alabama to make records in search of the so-called Muscle Shoals sound. And then one of the chapters in the book talks about Muscle Shoals sound as a thing, a concept, a marketing term, but I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm happy to talk about any questions. And so these events that centered on the Shoals recording industry, the long fetch, which takes place over about 10 years and spans several different countries, provide the framework to contextualize Paul Simon's 1972 arrival at Muscle Shoals Sound. So there are 3 key moments between 1969 and 71, helped to spread the Muscle Shoals mystique, each of which involve a non-American artist and 2 of which are directly connected. So both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones had recorded Arthur Alexander songs in the early 1960s, but neither the Stones or the Beatles had any idea about Muscle Shoals because nothing on the record labels mentioned Muscle Shoals. And we fast forward, and the Rolling Stones record Wild Horses, You Gotta Move, and Brown Sugar at Muscle Shoals Sound in 1969. And although no member of the rhythm section performed on the tracks recorded by the Stones, Jimmy Johnson engineered the sessions, and the studio and Johnson received studio and engineering credits respectively on the record Dust Jacket. So one of the things I did, the research was actually look at the physical 45s, and I was like, oh, the Muscle Soul sound, it says right here. So Rick Hall was, again, pioneered that, like, literally, he put the address of the studio on the actual 45, and no other record label or studio was doing that. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the record sleeves and 45s and all this, just to look for evidence of this thing called the Muscle Soul sound. And this is some evidence. So the release of Sticky Fingers in May 1971, which is the Stones' first album since '69, along with the success of Brown Sugar, which is a #1 single, and the album credit raised the symbolic capital of the Shoals as a recording destination within the world of popular music. And Gimme Shelter, the documentary released in December of '70 that chronicled the Stones' '69 tour, includes significant footage of the Stones, including listening to Wild Horses at Sound. And then there's also footage, if you know the movie, right? They're traveling to and from the Holiday Inn, and there's a close-up of the studio sign, and all of that quite literally raised the profile of the Shoals recording scene. Jamaican singer Jimmy Cliff was working on songs in 1969 for the album that would become known as Wonderful World, Beautiful People. Chris Blackwell, who was the head of Island Records, suggested that Cliff record a non-reggae track. So Blackwell paired Cliff with the Muscle Shoals rhythm section on the track Many Rivers to Cross. 2 years later, in March of '71, Blackwell sent Cliff back to Muscle Shoals sound in an attempt to further broaden the Jamaica singer's appeal. And Cliff recorded Sitting in Limbo at Muscle Shoals sound and released the track on another cycle. It also appears on The Harder They Come, although it's uncredited to the album and musicians. So at the time Cliff recorded it with Muscle Shoals rhythm section, reggae was relatively unknown in the United States. And David Hood remarked, Island Records sent him here trying to make him sound non-Jamaican. And what's interesting in Blackwell's estimation, having him become American was meant going to Alabama. And this was before, there's no other way to interpret that, because there were so many records coming out of here that were huge hits. So one of the hottest recording scenes was right here. And so this was before Bob Marley and the Jamaican thing got hold, and so they were trying to Americanize Jimmy Cliff's sound. So Island Records released albums by both Cliff and the British band Traffic, and by '71, Traffic's career had stalled. The band's drummer, Jim Capaldi, had recorded his first studio album, Oh How We Danced at Sound, in December of '71, and he encouraged the other members of the group to come to Alabama. And so in an attempt to revitalize their music, Traffic recorded Shootout at the Fantasy Factory at Muscle Soul Sound with members of the rhythm section, and this picture is taken actually at the studio. Traffic then toured in support of the album with Hood and Hawkins on bass and drums respectively, and eventually had Barry Beckett on keyboards while Jimmy Johnson mixed the front of House of Sound. And so the rhythm section's collaboration with Traffic had a profound impact on the future success of the studio musicians. Even though they had previously recorded with Jimmy Cliff, who was a bona fide reggae artist, it was while working with Traffic that the rhythm section first encountered reggae, and it became a vital element in furthering the Muscle Shoals mystique. So Traffic frequently listened to reggae while traveling on the tour bus. And so the Alabama musicians' casual introduction to reggae resulted in one of their most famous recordings, I'll Take You There. So fresh from their work with Traffic, the Muscle Shoals rhythm section returned to their studio where they blended the new sound of reggae with the staple singer's gospel influences. And this seemingly odd pair of seasoned studio musicians from Alabama with a folk music influence, blues-loving, jam-based rock band from England resulted in a reggae-soaked R&B track that became a #1 pop hit for Chicago-based gospel family quartet. Yes, it's a mouthful. So I'm going to play you the track Liquidator. This is 1969 by Harry J. All-Stars. This was, inspiration is not a strong enough word for what results in I'll Take You There. So you'll hear Liquidator, and then you'll hear I'll Take You There. Yeah. We can talk about that later. So Paul Simon first became aware of reggae in the late '60s, and so those who know anything about Paul Simon, right? So El Condor Pasa. So he's had a long interest in music from other places, primarily people of color. So El Condor Pasa, and then his influence here, and he goes on, right? He writes Cape Man. So he goes to South Africa, right? He goes to Brazil. So he's an omnivore, a musical omnivore. So Paul Simon first becomes aware of reggae in the late '60s because he lived in England when he was working with Garfunkel, and he dabbles with reggae in the early '70s on the song "Why Don't You Wrap Me" from the album Bridge Over Troubled Water. I'm not going to play this, but so he wanted to write a reggae song, but the musicians in New York could not understand the groove. And so Simon says at some point, it just comes out bad. So he then when after him and Garfunkel break up, he then records Mother and Child Reunion in Jamaica in 1972 with members of Jimmy Cliff's band. And so this is straight up reggae, and Simon does not. All he does is sing on the track because he couldn't figure out where to put his guitar in the mix. So after hearing "I'll Take You There," and at some point, Paul Simon asked Stax record executive Al Bell who the funky Jamaican musicians were on the reggae-infused track by the Staple Singers. This is all true, right? And so Bell responds that the band was the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, a group of musicians who owned and operated a studio in Northwest Alabama called the Muscle Shoals Sound Studio. And Bell also told Simon that the band was white and not black like Simon had imagined. And so in an effort to capture the unique sound and feel he heard in "I'll Take You There," Simon recorded several tracks with the rhythm section, including Kodachrome, "Loves Me Like a Rock," an American tune for his '73 album, There Goes Rhymin' Simon. So let's take a little listen to Kodachrome. So the rock press also picked up on Simon's intentions and new musical direction. So reviewing the album for Rolling Stone, Stephen Holden remarked that Simon's chief new musical element, one that he has hitherto eschewed, is black music, including R&B and gospel motifs, and that the singer had recorded more than half of the album in Muscle Shoals. So both Kodachrome and "Love Me Like a Rock" peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, and There Goes Rhymin' Simon received a Grammy nomination for Best Album that same year. So Simon's musical and racial assumptions exemplified the Muscle Shoals Mystique, so regional outsiders seeking authentic Southern black musical experiences. And several factors fueled Simon's assumptions. So, and first he noticed "I'll Take You There" because he thought the backing band, the rhythm section, was a funky Jamaican musician, and then the singer constructed this narrative about the Staples track based on his assumptions that a group of Jamaican reggae musicians could perform in such a deeply soulful style while supporting a black gospel group. Of course, the reason Simon came down here, Barry Beckett stated, was to get a black sound. So seeking the originators of the funky groove you heard in "I'll Take You There," Al Bell directed Simon to the rhythm section, who through years of recording experience could assimilate seemingly disparate musical styles into their own sound, and a few of which embodied notions of sonic blackness. And so the resulting collaboration with Simon produced yet another event that furthered the Muscle Shoals mystique. So I'm going to finish up with talking about music tourism here in the Shoals. So although the Shoals recording scene had achieved national and international acclaim within certain musical interest circles by the late 60s, only a relatively small number of people who lived in the area knew anything about what took place at the numerous local recording studios. In the early 70s, the Shoals recording industry personnel began to actively seek public acknowledgement and acceptance from the Shoals communities for the numerous ways the studios supported the local economy. And the support was significant. They generated millions of dollars and in salaries and taxes and all sorts of stuff. And so the groundwork laid during the 1970s and developed over the ensuing decades helped to establish a musical tourism foundation that has now become a significant part of the Shoals brand. And so the emergence of the Shoals as a destination for musical tourism, although it's certainly tied to the popularity of the 2013 documentary, actually has roots that stretch back into the early 70s. And so the long fetch of the Shoals music history, promoted by clever marketing, has given purpose to numerous recent events, and all while increasing tourism. So today I'm just going to highlight a few of these things. So on May 29th, 1971, Billboard ran a story announcing the first annual Muscle Shoals Music Celebration to be hosted by the Muscle Shoals Chamber of Commerce and the music industry on June 4th to the 6th. Does anybody remember this? This is 1971.
Yeah, I was there.
And so the announced activities include a parade, a picnic, concerts, a banquet, a talent contest, and behind-the-scenes tours of the studios. So 2 concerts were also scheduled, and one reason for the celebration, according to Buddy Draper, who was the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce at that time, was to let everyone know that the local recording industry has unlimited possibilities for benefiting the area. The celebration, however, was far from successful. According to news reports in the Times Daily and Billboard and others, the event lost about $4,000. And the celebration never happened again. And this is the funny part. So local residents and elected officials did not embrace the event because they feared that a hippie invasion would descend upon the area. And one of the articles, it was a Times Daily or it could have been Billboard, that was a quote. They were nervous. But this is a few years after Woodstock. So oh my God, these long-haired musicians, what are they going to do? So, and so no mayor from any of the 4 cities participated in the parades. So they were trying. So, in 1972, Dick Cooper began to write his weekly column, Shoals Music, about the local recording industry for the Sunday edition of the Times Daily. And so, I've looked at almost all these columns, including some of Stephanie's. And so, while the influence of Cooper's articles on the community relations between the studios and the public is unknown, the information was out there. Now, so Dick Cooper's article appeared like in the middle of typically in the women's section. It was about on like page 50. So it was very far from front page news, but it was out there. I mean, every week there was it's basically every week from 72 up through almost the 80s. A couple weeks here and there, like there was some telling about who had just who had come through town. So the information was out there, but I guess no one read it. I don't know. You all tell me. You live here. So, in early '73, the Shoals-based musicians and producers and engineers officially came together to promote the local recording industry in the area by establishing the Muscle Shoals Music Association. So the group held its first meeting in early February, electing officers and directors, establishing dues. Again, this I know it's kind of blurry, but Cashbox talked about this. Time Daily talked about this. So again, widely reported on. But not long after the association forms, Johnson, Hawkins, Hood, and Beckett all go on tour with Traffic, and then which likely caused the organization to stall. And so the initial version of this organization doesn't seem to accomplish too much, and there's no public record of the group ever meeting again. It could have met, but again, I found no public record of that, or even stuff I found at the Hall of Fame. It seemed like it just evaporated. So the organization reformed in '75. And one of the objectives was to raise the profile of the recording industry among area residents and local officials. And in September of '75, the association posted the billboard on Highway 43 that stated, Muscle Shoals Music Industry welcomes you, the hit recording capital of the world. So, Stephanie, get ready because you're next. So, in October of '75, the association successfully lobbied the Alabama legislature to pass tape piracy legislation, because tape piracy was a very big thing back then, and there was no federal laws against piracy, so we had to do it at the state level. So the association launched a songwriters showcase in '76, and in early '77, Ava Aldridge began hosting a monthly members-only songwriting workshop, and that same year, Buddy Draper became the executive director of the association, and he was the only paid employee for some time. And actually, probably one of the biggest finds I came across was that in '78, the association began to hold an annual records and producer seminar at Joe Wheeler State Park. And it hosted this multi-day seminar for 6 years, from '78 to '83. And at its height, the event attracted about 500 participants who traveled to the Shoals from across the States, Canada, Australia, and Europe. And as far as I can tell, this seminar was likely one of the first events of its kind in the US. So it predates South by Southwest by about 12 years. Beyond the NAMM show, which happens in LA, which is basically a music merchant show, which has been going on for 100+ years, there's nothing else like this. And so there's almost no histories of the South by Southwest. So again, I'm pretty sure this is the first event of its kind. Maybe some small meetings, but no multi-day conference. There were panels and fish fries, and they took riverboat cruises. It seemed like a lot of fun. So I'll leave it at that. So interest in creating some type of music hall dates back to '71. Actually, the idea behind the '71 celebration was to raise money to make a gold record hall of fame. That was the press release that said back then. But momentum builds in the '70s. And so Bobby Denton was influential, and others were, in moving the project from the idea stage toward a reality, although it took a long time, about a decade, to come to fruition. In '77, the Alabama State Legislature approved an act to establish the Alabama Music Hall of Fame Board, which is headquartered in Colbert County. They appropriated $25,000 in '82 for the construction of a building to house the Hall of Fame, and then the hall hosted its first induction ceremony in Birmingham in '85, and then in '87, a statewide vote approves a $2.5 million bond to fund the construction of the 12,000 square foot hall, which is across the river over in Tuscumbia, and the grand opening took place in July 26, 1990. So the use of the Singing River as a broadly used marketing slogan emerged slowly. So area resident Tom Hendricks helped generate and maintain interest in the Singing River legend through his self-made monument to his great-great-grandmother, known as Tom's Wall. And in 2009, Congress officially designated the heritage area, which used the phrase "the land of the Singing River" on the homepage, dedicated to promote the region. And over the past several years, the Shoals has promoted the legacy of the Singing River in novel ways. In 2010, the Patton Allen Bridge was renamed the Singing River Bridge, and the second of 4 oversized Singing River sculptures, one for each of the 4 cities in the Shoals, was unveiled in 2014. And as far as I know, this project is stalled. I don't know if anybody can tell me otherwise. It seems like there's not much momentum anymore for this. Tom Hendricks' passion for and dedication to his Native American ancestry has blossomed into something much bigger than the phrase he helped popularize. So speaking about the Singing River, Judy Sizemore, the first director of the Heritage Area, told me, "That legend, it's a great marketing tool." So when I found that quote again, I was like, oh wow, this is gonna be great. So local tourism boards and the Heritage Area incorporated the phrase into their promotional efforts, but there's little evidence of the widespread use of the term before 2013, which is the year the documentary gets released. Explore the Shoals is a full-color glossy magazine published yearly by the Times Daily and acts as a tourist guide that promotes cultural tourism. The 2009-2010 issue included only a few paragraphs about the Singing River in a section called Myths and Legends. By 2013, the Myths section included this sentence at the top of the page: "Every community has a legendary tale to tell, and the Shoals is no different. Stories and myths from the Shoals add unique flavor to the area and make for interesting conversation." So in many ways, the legend served as the film's through line. Even before the film crews arrived in the Shoals, the importance to the film of Native American cultures, as well as the Tennessee River, were evident. So a pre-production project overview that Nancy Gahn shared with me stated, "Music runs through the land, the river, and in the spirit of the native peoples who live there." The producers desired to make it clear that perhaps one of the reasons for the musicality of the area lies in the spirit of the land and the river, which was recognized by Native Americans who lived there. So in short, so even in this, you can sort of see the myth making being built, right? So these guys, I'm not sure where they came from. They were clearly reading the Bill McDonald stuff, and so they bought wholeheartedly into this myth, which is only just getting popular a few years before they showed up in the Shoals. And actually, when I was first here in 2011, they were actually making the movie while I was here, although I never ran across them. So in short, there is nothing subtle about the way the director connects the music of the Shoals to both the Tennessee River and local Native American traditions. And the release of the documentary, which is 10 years ago, acted as a catalyst for the music tourism in the Shoals, and the hidden musical histories galvanized the region in a way that almost nothing had done before. So from 2014 through 2019, direct references to the Singing River legend in the Explore the Shoals actually decreased. The popularity of the film likely caused a shift in marketing strategies of local tourism agencies, but the connections between music and the river did not disappear. In 2014, the welcome essay in the Shoals simply stated, "Attempting to explain the remarkable music heritage of the Northwest Alabama, the renowned Muscle Shoals documentary eventually concludes there must be something in the water down there." And I mean, that's the phrase that's used at the Culver County, Franklin, Rob Carnegie. Florence, it was a long day yesterday. Florence Tourism, like the sign says it's in the water down there. So ads for Singing River Brewery and Singing River Live began to appear in 2015, followed by ads for Singing River Dentistry in 2018. And so between 2009 and 2019, I'm really glad you're all laughing. So the phrase Singing River transformed from referring to a Native American legend into a branding term used to routinely describe the origins of the local music industry, as well as a marketing slogan to clean your teeth and sell beer. and as recently as last week, so Southern Living ran an article by Natalie Channon about the Singing River, how the Singing River inspired creative. This was last week, or whatever March 8th was. So it has taken a long time for the local population to warmly embrace the legacy of the Shoals music industry. So during the 90s and up to the 2015, the majority of music tourists who visited the Shoals were either from Europe, or musicians, or music aficionados, or both. And the release of the documentary and the acclaim that followed animated the people in the Shoals. So Reed Watson, label manager for Single Lock Records in Florence, explained how the documentary affected the local music industry this way. He said, "The movie is like a BC-AD thing for this area. It created sort of a California gold rush moment. Everybody that was in the business here realized the light bulb went off, and it was like, oh, we have tourists here now. We need to take advantage of this." And this sort of started a whole new kind of industry that I don't think anybody was paying attention to. So notions first articulated in Mrs. O'Neill's 1917 very interesting pamphlet have been used by many as a rhetorical strategy to ascribe the 1950s origins, 1960s and 70s successes, and the current rebirth of the Muscle Shoals sound. Now, tightly interwoven, both fact and myth further reinforce the Muscle Shoals mystique. So numerous people worked very hard to establish the Shoals recording industry. Some of you were in this room. Even more people and multiple agencies helped to develop it into a viable cultural band over the ensuing decades. The Singing River explanation, it kind of ticks me off a little bit, Reed Watson told me, because it discounts how revolutionary and how bold it was for people to think they could start a record business in this area when they did. This town, and the story of this town is built on people just saying, F it, I'm gonna do what I wanna do, and I find that very inspiring. The foundations of the Muscle Shoals recording scene were only laid during the mid-1950s. So using the legend of the Singing River as a starting point, the historical music timeline of the Shoals originated when native tribes first inhabited the area during the infancy of the world, circa 800 BCE, but didn't become established until 1956. Local beliefs coupled with larger-than-life physical objects such as the Singing River sculptures have connected the Shoals music traditions to the region's indigenous peoples, effectively creating a nearly 2,000-year-old musical tradition. Or in other words, an unrivaled popular music creation story. Thank you. Thank you so much. We step out this side. So I think we have some time for questions if anybody has any comments or thoughts or what.
Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so, yes.
How did you decide to do this?
So someone, there we go. So, I'm a musician, so, I grew up with vinyl, or vinyl as my students call them. And you know, I first heard Sweet Home Alabama sometime probably in the mid '70s. Started playing the song. I had no idea. Like most people had no idea who the Swampers were. It's funny. David had told me, he's like, when that song came out, oh, you'd be famous. Like, no one knows. That's our nickname. No one knows us by that name. And so I fast forward. I played a bunch of band cover songs and stuff. And so in 2009, when I went to start my PhD in Chapel Hill, there's an archive called the Southern Folk Life Collection. It's a massive amount of stuff about the South, records, cookbooks, everything about the South. And so we were asked to write a seminar paper using an archival source. And so in that collection, there's a small box of stuff by Jerry Wexler. And in that box, there is it was a typed manuscript article that he wrote for Billboard called "What It Is Swamp Music Is What It Is." So he was very clever that way. And so I wrote a 40-page seminar paper. And as I was doing research about it, in the article, he described several different vignettes of jam sessions. Some were real, some were imagined, and two of them are in Muscle Shoals. And so I was thinking about music and race and the South. And so I realized that at that point, there was almost no sources about Muscle Shoals, even though there were thousands of recordings. So basically, there's two chapters, a chapter by Peter Kwolnick, written in Sweet Soul Music. I think it's just called Fame in Muscle Shoals. And a British author called Barney Hoskins had a chapter, but there's no sources about the Shoals. So like, oh my goodness, I found my dissertation within weeks of going to my first seminar. And so this whole project started in 2009. And I did my PhD in 5 years, and I went to the Shoals and did research in 2011. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has an archive, and Fame had given the Rock Hall about 60 linear feet of stuff, contracts, all sorts of stuff. And so I've been there twice, and spent just 8 hours a day looking at photographs and taking notes and stuff. And they also, Spoonie Oldham stuff is there as well as many other musicians. And so writing, and then long story short, like I graduated and took a while for me to get a tenure track job. And so the book was kind of on hold because of no job. There was no reason to write. There was no motivation to write the book, even though I have 60 gigabytes of data. And so once I got the job, I was friendly with the publisher, the editor of the series, and so she reached out to me and was like, "Hey, what's going on?" I'm like, "Funny you should ask." And so and then I started writing the book in about 2018 in earnest, and then I came down here and spent 4 or 5 weeks, and then it just took a while to go. I mean, I have so much sources, and I had to figure out what the storyline was. So I knew some of the things I tell are the Gornick tells, but I tell in way different detail. And the Gornick book, which is wonderful, is he has a very specific way he tells the story, and he doesn't. I try to complicate the reasons, like why did all this happen? I don't have any answers to this. And as Carrie said in the back of the book, like her blurb was like, "Oh, now we can say why Muscle Shoals." I don't know why Muscle Shoals. I still don't know why, even though I've spent a good portion of my life researching it. So that's a very long answer to your question, but so yeah, that's the story. And I've met a lot of friends along the way too.